So yes, we're looking at Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge today in response to William Wordsworth, who we looked at last time in his preface to Lyrical Ballads, and noted that that preface tended to be regarded by pretty much everyone as the manifesto for Romanticism. Sorry, you're right behind that, aren't you? It's terrible. It's given a great deal of credence based on the fact that it's seen as the manifesto, because it then defines what Romanticism is, and which is very helpful since Romanticism isn't even used in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, the word. So this defines Romanticism, okay, but he doesn't use the word, so where does the word come from? I puzzled about this for years, and the definition where it is first used, I mentioned a few classes ago, is from Schlegel, where he describes Romanticism as progressive universal poetry. But that's going to hurt the feelings of the English to have a German define what Romanticism is, and it generally is juxtaposed to classicism. Furthermore, so this is one of the challenges that we get into in literary theory now, is that there are definitions and even contrasts that don't seem to relate to each other. So Romanticism is often juxtaposed to neoclassicism. It pushes against neoclassical poetics. It also pushes back against the Enlightenment. So you'll say, and the overemphasis on reason of the Enlightenment is repaired through the imagination in the Romantics. You'll hear that as well. All of these are true, but they don't seem to relate to one another particularly well. And so once again, then what is Romanticism exactly? I think that the Schlegel's definition is very helpful because the universality and the progressiveness of the poetry is its primary feature. But then I dug down last time and said, okay, so if we're going to say that, what's the root of the progressive universal poetry? And I think it's clear from looking at Wordsworth that it's in feeling. He defines poetry as the spontaneous, he says, at least all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, which is not a linguistic thing at all. He's not defining it against neoclassical poetics per se. He's not taking issue with features of neoclassical poetics. I don't like, rhyming couplets or something like that, or the ideals of Horace being articulated through a different age. It's something deeper than that, and it's not really about the poetics. It's more about a way of thinking about reality. So it is closer to a reaction against the Enlightenment in a certain form, but again, what form? And it is about language. He makes it very clear it's about language, and he does refer to neoclassical, so forth, but at root isn't the neoclassical poetics specifically, because he doesn't engage with that at all. He does want to talk about what language refers to, and that is the difference. It's thoughts upon feelings rather than words that relate to thoughts. It's words that relate to feelings. That's what he thinks that it's about. So it's a debate over natural language, and he's leaning into the Rousseau side of the argument and agreeing with Rousseau that language in its early origin begins in grunts and cries like the animals, and then it over time develops through other noises that we call words, which acquire significance through social agreement and a social contract. But the ultimate reality is the feelings that give rise to the words, and the words are signs that point to those things, namely the feelings, and the feelings are the ultimate reality. Now, I juxtapose that idea of the signa and the res, the words being the signs and the res being the things. For Augustine, the res is God, the ultimate res, and all signs point to God ultimately, and if they don't, then he talks about a disordered use of signs, and they're falsely applied. And then so he introduces the idea of the ordo amoris. He doesn't use that term, that's used afterwards, but the idea that we're on a journey towards God. And therefore, the signs need to be pointing us in that direction. And life is to be understood in the light of that ultimate reality. And Scripture, he proposes a non-Christian doctrine, does exactly that. It points us towards the goal of our lives, the purpose and meaning of our lives, namely union with God. But how are we to understand that? We could think of it linguistically, and Augustine does deal with language, but ultimately he is going to predicate it on who God is and what he's like, and he's going to talk about it then in terms of love. God is love, and we understand him, when we read Scripture rightly, we understand that we are to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and we're to love our neighbor as ourselves. That's the right reading. And if we read Scripture at odds with that, then we haven't understood it properly. And we will have, so with the order of love in mind, we read Scripture. This is the hermeneutic key. And we will be motivated to act in accordance with that. Then we've rightly read it. When we're moved to do what Scripture has persuaded us is the meaning of our lives. So it's a very interesting, and it is a hierarchical thing. So the signs, the words, motivate us towards the Word, the capital W word, and they also motivate us to live godly lives in accordance with the ethic of Jesus himself. And so doing, I think we become humanized. So it's the goal of the humanities, is to be Christ-like. But if we take the 18th century view of natural language, language is a reflection upon our feelings, if we're the Romantics, or on our thoughts, if we're in the philosophical school, then it's a very different thing altogether, and there's no purpose to our feelings or our thoughts. There's no eschatological purpose. There's no goal to feelings other than to get closer to the feelings. And that's what Wordsworth does in his Poetics. He pulls us closer to that common ground between all people, which is in their feelings. And so the methodology is that of empathy. This keeps twisting here. I'm sorry for that. But the method of empathy, which is drawing ourselves into the other person's feelings so that we can almost inhabit them, and that will be the methodology that is used in the Geisteswissenschaften, the human sciences as well. We will read texts, say, written by the Apostle Paul, and say with Schleiermacher that we can know as well, if not better, than Paul did. We can feel his feelings, and yet because of historical distance, we can see that we've made progress since his day, because we recognize that people have been offended by what Paul has said, and we, in wanting to acknowledge the legitimacy of their feelings, will downplay the hard contours of what Paul says with his words, because his words were only ever referring to the ultimate reality, which is the common feeling anyway. So this is a way of interpreting Scripture that will go at odds with the words then that Paul writes, because the words, again, follow the rationale of the natural language camp. The words are not anything true unto themselves. The feelings are true. The words are a social construct that we can change so that they reflect a closer approximation of what they were originally intended to do, which is social feeling. And so we can do what from another side is called eisegesis. We can read into the text, say, well, what Paul was really trying to say is this. He did say that, yes, but the reason he said that is because of his cultural context. But if he lived in our day, he would never say what he said there. He would say what we're saying, because the true thing that we are expressing is the spirit, not the word. So there's an anti-logocentrism that's that arises out of the natural language movement. And I mentioned that phrase, anti-logocentrism, because it's a word that will be used next semester by Jacques Derrida. He calls the whole Western tradition logocentric, and he's against logocentrism. This is Jacques Derrida, French post-structuralist, actually deconstructionist writer. So the Western tradition is characterized by the legitimacy of the logos, when really the ultimate reality isn't the logos, it's something in between the logos, behind the logos, it's the spirit. And so he deconstructs our attempts. It's a project that he undertakes. He deconstructs the foregoing connection of the Western intellectual tradition to the legitimacy of the logos. Now, some people could see that as explicitly against Christ. I don't think he intends it that way per se. He wants to deal with the consequences of that, although ultimately I think there must be some sort of direct repudiation of the logos of God. And so this is where then it becomes so practical and important in life, is, do our words actually reveal truth? And do they lay hold of that? And can we use words to communicate truly and truths? Is there a common, like the words, we can talk about words, we can debate about words, we can demonstrate true and false statements through the laws of logic. If Derrida is correct, the laws of logic are just some sort of a game that are used, a power play, but they're not really a means of communication. You can see why philosophers hate Derrida. You have a comment or a question? Sorry.
Yeah, just with, I mean, like you were saying with Augustine, how he has the correspondence between the res and the signa, and like the words are the signa, and they correspond to the truth, right?
Yes.
For the like romantic idea, would it be too like I guess formal or structured to be able to say that the feelings were the res for them? Like, or is that true, or is that not?
Well, it seems to be. That's what I mean, in my romantics class, which I'm doing alongside that, we've observed in the poetry that frequently they have various means of demonstrating that words fail them to express sublimity. And one of them is they just explicitly refer to silence or things that represent an absence of sound, but there's still a feeling there that's palpable beneath the surface. Sometimes they'll refer to a ruin, a typical sublime landscape. So Wordsworth writes Tintern Abbey about a ruined abbey, which nature has degraded through wind and water and so forth. The roof has caved in. And yet it's the topos of meditation on the power of the sublime, namely the inexpressible, to express a reality greater than our words can describe. So there's something deeply spiritual about it, for sure. And that was recognized in his day. There's something profoundly against the Enlightenment's tendency towards materialism, and reductive materialism at that, to say that the physical world is all that there is. And the scientific method will deliver us truths about reality that we can measure, that we can quantify, and that we can understand that way, and understanding human beings in a similar sort of way. We can just see people as brains in vats, or they're just physical beings. And it goes against the whole of, I would say, human nature to make that conclusion. Every religion will be in disagreement with that view. They will all say, actually, the real reality of humanity is that there's a spirit in us that is greater than that. I'm not even speaking from a Christian tradition here. The Eastern will also say the same thing. No, the real thing is the spirit. Same all pagans have held this view of repute. I mean, the idea that we're material beings, and that's all that there is to say, is totally irrational. If that's true, then thinking is not possible even. We think that we're thinking when really it's just a biochemical response and so forth. I think that's just not, it makes no sense. Makes no sense of language either. Anyway, but there is a sort of reductionism that goes with that view. So where did I go with that? So what was the question again? Actually, the res and the signa.
Yeah, well, I guess just after that.
Oh, the poetics.
Yeah, well, what I'm really wondering is, like, would their idea of words being sort of like signs, right? Like Augustine says, right, how words are like necessarily signs. Would they essentially agree with that? Or
I think they do agree with it to some degree, but the signs are arbitrary. And they are temporary. They're not eternal. There's no such thing as the right word. There's a situationally correct word, but that it won't hold. And so Shelley is the most consistent with this view, and he will create a beautiful image that will describe something, and then he'll let it just sort of collapse and then produce another image through language. But then that will fade away as well, and he wants to assign no permanence to even what we call grammar. So in his little essay on life, he talks about exactly that, how the words that we use to describe personhood, I, you, he, she, it, are just signs that don't refer to any real thing, but they're used for pragmatic reasons. But there's no real difference between I and you. It's all, he literally says, it's modifications of the one mind. That's his view of language. That's our contemporaries' view of language as well. This is why we have gender identity discussions, because they don't think grammar, the terms of grammar, the distinctions between persons, they see those as divisive, because the words are the obstacle to the ultimate reality, which is the feelings that people have, and they want to express themselves. Right? So I say it's all a function of what happens in this period. Our contemporary landscape is rooted in the 18th century and developed in the Romantic period, and we're still in that loop. This is why I think a Christian education is very important, and even the approach I've taken on this course and looking at language. Is this the only way of looking at language? Can we not see it differently? Is this view that they posit correct, that language really is just originates in feelings and it develops out of that, and so we give rise to a developmental psychology or an evolutionary psychology? Is that true? I mean, it's a hypothesis, so it's a theory. Okay, how good is the theory in explaining things? Let's use their language. How good is that hypothesis? I think it's not very good myself. I think it doesn't give account to language and what language does. And it results in all the things that most people regard as detrimental to human life. It means that we actually can't communicate. We cannot adjudicate between true and false because we can't appeal to the laws of logic. You can't prove somebody wrong. Because the words are never able to do that. It's just a sign. And it's an arbitrary sign at that. And it's just the endless play of signifiers. That's what we mean by communication. But really it's a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing. As Macbeth says at the end of his life. Out of his existential despair, having thrown away all moral legitimacy, he knows what right and wrong was. He did the wrong thing. And he knows the consequences of that. Anyway, we're going far from Coleridge. But Coleridge is responding to Wordsworth, and specifically, he is provoked by Wordsworth's definition of the imagination. Now, in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, he doesn't talk about the imagination. He talks about poetry, etc. But he mentions the imagination in 1815. Now, let me see if I can find this here. I know I can. Oh, it's still further down. He's not brief, Mr. Coleridge. We're getting close to it now. He mentions that Wordsworth provoked him to this, to write this, and it's extraordinary. It's in chapter 12 where he finally gets this. So he talks about Kant and his disagreement with Kant, for that matter, but he mentions his disagreement with Wordsworth. There we go. So this is in chapter 12, towards the end. It's page 198 of this edition, 197 rather. I shall now proceed to the nature and genesis of the imagination. Okay. Having up to this point traced his own intellectual development, he mentions all sorts of figures of associationist psychology, namely a sort of materialism. One of them is David Hartley. He names one of his sons after him. So early on, he finds this very interesting. The ideas and excitement relating to one another, well, that sounds very much like Wordsworth. In a state of excitement, our ideas connect to one another. How do they do that? Hartley's proposal was one that Coleridge himself entertained. These are the heirs of Locke, John Locke. Ideas that arise from empirical phenomena that come out of that. And Wordsworth then, more recently in 1815, comes out with an edition of poems and an essay on the imagination, and this is the final straw for Coleridge. When he realizes, now I know why I don't agree with Mr. Wordsworth. So here. I must proceed to the nature and genesis of the imagination, but I must first take leave to notice that after a more accurate perusal of Mr. Wordsworth's remarks on the imagination in his preface to the new edition of his poems, I find that my conclusions are not so consentient with his as I confess I'd taken for granted. He had taken for granted that they were on the same page. In an article contributed by me to Mr. Southey's Omniana, on the soul and its organs of sense, are the following sentences. These, the human faculties, I would arrange under the different senses and powers as the eye, the ear, the touch, etc. The imitative power, voluntary and automatic, the imagination, or shaping and modifying power, the fancy, or the aggregative and associative power, the understanding, or the regulative, substantiating and realizing power, the speculative reason, vis theoretica et scientifica, or the power by which we produce or aim to produce unity, necessity, and universality, etc., etc. So he gets on that, and so he talks about sensation and volition. He starts talking himself into a corner as ever, and so then he concludes off with that. But note here where he goes with it, and this is what's very interesting. Chapter 13 begins with a quotation from Paradise Lost. And what is the quotation from Paradise Lost referring to? Let me get rid of this. Quotation from Paradise Lost. O Adam, one Almighty is, from whom all things proceed, and up to him return, if not depraved from good. Created all such to perfection, one first matter all, endued with various forms, various degrees of substance, and in things that live of life, but more refined, more spirituous and pure, as nearer to him placed, or nearer tending, each in their several active spheres assigned, till body up to the spirit work in bounds proportioned to each kind. So from the root springs lighter the green stalk, from thence the leaves more airy, last the bright consummate flower spirits odorous breathes. Flowers and their fruit man's nourishment, by gradual scale sublimed, to vital spirits aspire, to animal, to intellectual, give both life and sense, fancy and understanding, whence the soul reason receives, and reason is her being, discursive or intuitive. There you go. So he quotes Mr. Milton, talks about reason coming out of the others. Now note also there's a hierarchy here, and we can see an approximation of the ordo amoris here then as well. Because the beings that are most intellectual, namely the angels, love God immediately with their minds. We share something of that, but we have a physical body and so forth. We need to eat. But what do we eat? Do we eat the roots? Well, I guess we eat potatoes. But in general, we eat the fruits and the flower, the things that are at the most distance from them, that they've sublimed or taken the essence of what is in the root. And this is a sort of an analogy of the hierarchy. You could say the great chain of being. Some people think that that's what's being illustrated here. I think there's more than that. It's a hierarchy within the human person in which reason is placed above the passions. and above the spirited element for that matter, or the will. He's just left off talking about the will, by the way, in the previous chapter. So he cites this, and to me, if he's going to cite reason being her being, discursive or intuitive, he sounds like an Enlightenment figure, or at least he could, because he's appealing to the goodness of reason. Who among the Romantics ever talks this way? Certainly not Shelley. Certainly not Keats. Certainly not Wordsworth. Nor Blake. Byron just sort of avoids the whole topic. Byron's doing Byron things. But he is now making a significant disagreement here. And so he talks about Descartes, and then he talks about the venerable sage of Königsberg, who's Immanuel Kant, and he's talked about this as a master of some sorts, but then he says that he cannot believe Kant's conclusion. He thinks the conclusion is impossible. I cannot believe he doesn't mean more by this than that. And he starts going on, and he thinks, how do I land this plane? I can't, like, here I am going on with another chapter and a long excursion, and so I'm going to have to stop myself. And so he receives a letter. Dear C, well, this is to himself, shut up and get to the point. You ask my opinion concerning your chapter on the imagination, etc. So he introduces this. I wrote my master's thesis on this, by the way, and what goes on there. And in consequence of this very judicious letter, which produced complete conviction on my mind, I shall content myself for the present with stating the main result of the chapter. Okay, so I'm going to get to the point. Which I've reserved for the future, that future publication, a detailed prospectus of which the reader will find at the close of the second volume. The book is published, included no prospectus, and it is likely that Coleridge never got around to writing it. Yes, that's correct. He never got to it. So we're going to satisfy ourselves with this. I do love Coleridge. But, so he just finally gives us his definition of the imagination. And this is where he is at odds. He pronounces himself significantly at odds with Wordsworth, having cited Milton and his appeal to reason, and reason in different ways, discursive or intuitive. These are medieval categories. He's in with the traditional view on this. He is agreeing with Milton furthermore on this, because Milton is not, even though all the other Romantics are appealing to Milton, they read Milton like they read everyone else as saying something really important, but not as important as what they're saying, because he hadn't made as much progress as they had. We can look down on Milton. He was great in his day, but you know what? We've moved on from belief in God and those sorts of things. We know better now than what Mr. Milton did. But Milton's great as a stepping stone or a rung in the ladder, and we're at the top of the ladder. We're looking down on Milton, we're looking down on Scripture, even if we accorded any truth like Blake does. Blake calls it the living edicts of the imagination, even. Imagination is this wonderful faculty. Okay, they all agree on that, but what does Coleridge say? He gives two definitions, and one is a foundation for the other. Remember, all being comes from God, and he talks about roots and shoots and branches and flowers. Well, the primary imagination is like the roots and the trunk. And the secondary arises out of it. You can't have the flowers without the roots and the tree. Right? The leaves don't come from nowhere. And you can't interpret a text, so this is where the hermeneutic is going to apply. You can't interpret a text by ripping the tree out of the ground, or taking a leaf off the tree and saying the leaf is the essence of the tree. You have to keep it attached to the tree. You always have to keep them united. And see, there's a connection. There's a rootedness of the present in the past, and the past has some, or at least our human nature. And he's going to say the same thing about words. We can develop the mind, the intellect, through language. Yes, there's a progressive aspect to the intellectual life, yes, But progress is not an absolute, it's in relation to what was true and remains true. And it can't contradict that truth either. Well, this is a check on progressive secularism, of course. It's a total check. And it's a repudiation of the idea that what's coming in the future is superior to what happened in the past, which is just what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery. They're dead. They can't argue with us. We say we know better. We're not going to have any of them come back and disagree with us, so we can claim that without fear of contradiction. We don't even know what they're talking about. You know what? We don't care what they were talking about because their words don't matter at the end of the day. So we can dismiss it. It's just too complicated. So this is the anti-intellectualism of the progressive secular university, which has led us down such a dark path that we live in right now. But anyway, what's his definition? The imagination, then, I consider either as primary or secondary. So it's one of the two. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. That's a bit of a mouthful. But it's relatively concise. For Coleridge, it's extraordinarily concise, actually, because he's nothing if not verbose. Note that it clearly has Christian or at least biblical connotations. When he talks about the eternal act of creation and he refers to the infinite I am, he's referring to God and the act of creation mentioned in Genesis, both of those two. So you can read behind this, look at Genesis 1 as a text, 1 and 2, and look at John 1 verses 1 to 17. Look at those beside one another. And you can see the clear echoes there. And furthermore, when it talks about the I am, you're probably dealing with Exodus 3, where Moses meets God in the burning bush, and he asks God who he is, because he hears a voice, and he says, I am that I am. So he is being. He defines reality. I mean, it's a very cryptic response in some ways, but I am is sort of, what sign can God give that isn't self-referential? To explain his being to Adam, to Moses, he would have to use a word that would encapsulate everything that he is, but no word can show that, because that would be a small thing. Everything, he's being, I am. Aquinas will that will be the cornerstone of Thomistic philosophy. Coleridge is aware of that, of course. But it's clearly a theological definition, is what I want to say here. And furthermore, we also see another feature. It's the living power and prime agent of all human perception even. We see, because God gives us the capacity as those that bear his image to even perceive reality as he wants us to see it. And it's a living power. It remains the prime agency. So we bear the image of God, and there's something even in the capacity to perceive that reflects that divine character in us. But he will further say that it's a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal. So it's thinking God's thoughts after him is the way I frame it. Try and translate it. Translation always has its dangers, but it's repeating what God says the nature of the world is, because God says it. And so it's going to be explicitly be rooted in revelation. That there are two types of revelation. There's special revelation, which we call Scripture, and there's natural revelation, which Augustine refers to also when he's talking in De Doctrina on things that we learn. We learn about the world around us, and the seven liberal arts will deal with those things. Those are means of knowledge. They're means of revelation, but they're not unambiguous, and they're easy to misconstrue. And among other things, we don't even know that there's one God from them, or at least people have often drawn the false conclusion on this. The ancient pagan Greeks and Romans thought there were many gods. But Paul in Romans 1 says that they have now been disabused of that. They've come to an idea that actually there's only one God. And I think you can see that in Plato. He's already pushing against the polytheism of his day by saying that there's not justices and goodnesses and truths. There's one of these things. There's a unity there. And he appeals to that. He doesn't call it God. And people to this day, people are puzzled by how could Plato have come to this conclusion? Where did he get this idea? Some think it's from his time in Egypt, and he might have been exposed to the Hebrew scriptures. And it was transformative on his life. I think it's a bit of speculation, but I think some of the church fathers thought that. Anyway, but it's that. So that's the primary. When I say the primary, think of it as a foundation for everything else. Now, the secondary imagination is rooted in that and will then create literature based on it, create art based on it. But we can't reconstruct the grammar of creation. It's given. We see that way. When we speak and use the I, you, he, she, it, we're just recognizing this is the way it is. I'm speaking to another person. And they're distinct enough that I'm not going to say I'm going to say I, thou. There's someone that's there who is another I, but they're not the same as me, so I want to recognize that in the language that acknowledges the distinct reality of that person and gives them honor. So I'll speak to them that way, and our grammar reflects that. And in reference to other people, there's a multiplicity of them. Those I's and you's are either male or female. And that's an important bit of knowledge about them. Their maleness or females. It helps us learn how to think about them in some ways and relate to them. Those are baked into the created order. So we can't be imaginative and deviate from that and call it imagination. It's just misapprehension. But the secondary I consider as an echo of the former. Note first, coexisting with the conscious will, yet still is identical with the primary in the kind of its agency and differing only in degree. So it's the same kind, and it's only a degree. What sort of degree? A lesser degree. So poets, even if we want to talk about them having creative abilities and capacities with language to express new thoughts, have a derivative or a secondary. Now, Tolkien, I think, is following the same trajectory of thinking when he talks about subcreation, right? Creation, that's what Iluvatar does. Subcreation is what Tolkien and poets do. Very much, I think, a Coleridgean line of thought. They're both on the same path. That's how I've always understood them at any rate. And in the mode of operation. So what is the mode? It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates. Okay, so it breaks apart in order to recreate, or where this process is rendered impossible, yet still at all events it struggles to idealize and to unify. It is essentially vital even as all objects are essentially fixed and dead. So if I say a word to describe this lectern, the lectern's a dead thing. It is an object. But the word is more vital because it's an attribute of that whole functional creative process. In a sense, the word is more real than the object. But not to the materialist, it's the other way around. So there's a living power, right? That's what he said about the primary to begin with. It's a living power and prime agent of all human perception. So words have not only is he disagreeing with Derrida about logocentrism, he's saying that logocentrism is the only real power. It's not the spirit. It's not the feeling. It's the word. And the word works with the Spirit, but it governs the Spirit. Just like the Holy Spirit floodlights Christ, the Word of God, and always directs us to Christ, because Christ is fulfilling the will of the Father. There's a triune activity here. In the same way, human language, although it's spiritually discerned, and Augustine even talks about this, when I speak, I articulate a sound that comes out of, it's in my mind first of all. I have a word which I express through my voice. It goes through the air into your ear and translates into your mind into the very same word in your mind. And this is how the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit can be all distinct and yet unified. We have the same word in our minds. The same word. There's a unity there. So there's the means of communication. It's a common union. If language doesn't work that way, our feelings are a barrier to community. Anyway, pushing it. So this is very interesting, I think. Now, and very different from what the Romantics have said thus far. And my take on Coleridge is he is disagreeing with the Romantics. The reason I say this is important is because if you read scholars on Coleridge, they say that Coleridge, even though the Preface to Lyrical Ballads is the manifesto of Romanticism, that Coleridge is the chief theorist of the Romantics. Because of this, because he defines the imagination for us. But his definition of the imagination is at odds with the other Romantics. Clearly with Wordsworth. We could have looked at Wordsworth's take on the imagination, but it's less influential anyway. So my take is that Coleridge is, in a sense, the tradition, great tradition, to some degree, speaking against this new way of thinking about literature and language that has arisen in the 18th century and is still with us. But that's my private debate with the Academy, I guess, although I've written it up in my doctoral thesis, and I think it could be more coherent than it is. But that's my take here. He's plainly disagreeing with Wordsworth. There's no way of seeing it. And he's plainly talking about the imagination, but his view of the imagination is exactly the point of contention. There is no other. Okay, so then where does he... I'll skip over the fancy and so forth that comes after this. And then we'll go into volume 2, because he wants to then talk and take issue with Mr. Wordsworth specifically, and I have about 25 minutes to get into that here, so let me try and do that as quickly as I can. But remember, Wordsworth talks about the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, the desire to speak the language of real men, and the language of real men as it's most vividly felt is among the rustics, because the rustics are in the presence of nature and its best expressions, and that there's a sort of an effect, a cycle, a loop, a feedback loop of feeling in the rustic connected to nature, which is not so far divorced from it the way people in cities are, where they use language all the time, where they communicate, and there's repetitiveness about their occupations and so forth, which takes them away from what's really important to people. And what's really important to them are those natural feelings that they've experienced as childhood. So the Romantics are always appealing back to childhood feelings as they germinate, and then reflecting back and imagining and thinking about that early stage in life. So there's an idealization of the child, also the native, also the savage. When I say the savage, those in the ancient world. So the Greeks are preferred to the Romans because they're closer to nature. They're less bound by cities. They're not as ruled by laws. They're more passionate, whatever. And they love a figure by the name of Ossian. I've mentioned this in my Romantic class, who is a Celtic bard, allegedly, found by a scholar by the name of James McPherson, who in 18th century Germany in particular is hailed as the great Celtic bard. And he writes the most sublime poetry because his feelings are just vivid and and powerful and emotive. Goethe refers to him in glowing terms because of this sublimity that is cited about him. Note the word sublime there, and connect it to what I said about Burke, and connection with terror and power and so forth. Ossian expresses this. Well, Ossian happens to be, as it turns out, a fraud. Macpherson wrote the poetry himself, attributed it to the Celtic bard Ossian, and so I have always, when I note this, say, well, if Goethe perceived sublimity in Macpherson's writing, why does it stop being sublime when we find the real author? And the answer is it shouldn't, if it's that good. But the better answer is the reason it does is because the language was never what was great about Ossian. It was the feeling, and the feelings are now been filtered by a cultured, civilized individual, so they can't have the same primacy as the savages. So there's a cult of origins here in the West, which we have to this very day. The people that are less civilized are better people, and we have wronged them by bringing civilization into their midst, as it were. Just by, never mind what is done, but just simply it sort of goes against the Star Trek's prime directive. You've interfered. Yeah. The prime directive, you shouldn't interfere. You shouldn't change that culture. You have to let it be as it is. Don't touch that plant. Let it grow on its own. If you change it, then you've disobeyed the prime directive. Don't appropriate it, don't change it, don't transform it. Whatever you do, don't exercise dominion over it through language. Don't appoint them to a reality that they don't yet know. Don't preach the gospel to them. Don't talk about the truth. Don't talk about common ground. Don't influence them at all. Let them be. Star Trek's based on the same romantic idea, obviously. And so is the United Nations to this day. Actually, some of the fundamental ideas of the law of nations, the right to self-determination and so forth, and it's a romantic idea. Very romantic idea. What's the basis of national identity? It's usually language. Okay. Language, however, is not the real issue. It's a different feeling from a different people articulated in that language, etc. So it just results in this relativism, but a relativism which is enforced in a unified fashion. In other words, it's everybody's right in their own way, and there's nothing arbitrating between them. It's just radical, fragmentary, disintegrated humanity. Sort of like the Tower of Babel. So what is required then, if that's the case, to control the Tower of Babel and the consequences of it is a unified authority to hold things together, and rules and laws, and they will look after the chaos. Because romantic theories are ultimately chaotic. Appealing to the emotions is chaotic. Oh, by the way, one final thing. There's a book out there. I neglected to mention that last time, but mentioned feelings. From Passions to Emotions. This is it. This is an interesting book, but you can see right there. The creation of a secular psychological category. We talk about emotions now. This is not the word that's used in the 18th century or anything before. They talk about the passions. We don't use that word passions anymore other than in reference to sex or something like that. Or to really, we've talked about somebody being passionate. But in general, we don't talk about what Wordsworth calls feelings as passions. We call them the emotions. The emotions are something that expressed outwards. It's not a faculty we have. So this book, very interesting book by Thomas Dixon at the University of Cambridge, came out 2009, talks about the development of this psychological category. And it, in turn, arises from Burke's distinction between the sublime and the beautiful. Because remember, those are different types of emotions, and they're related to power. I always note linguistic shifts, etymological changes, and the effect they have on ideas. So it's very interesting. I just wanted to alert you to that. I don't make too much of that. So back to this. He's giving us a sort of, remember, this is a Biographia Literaria. It's the sketches of his literary life, how he developed as a writer and a thinker. And they both agree on the power of giving the interest of novelty by the modifying colors of imagination. They both agree on that. But they have a different understanding of the imagination. We've just seen that. The thought suggested itself, to which of us I do not recall, that a series of poems might be composed of two sorts. In one, the incidents and agents were to be, in part at least, supernatural, and the excellence aimed at was to consist in the interesting of the affections by the dramatic truth of such emotions as would naturally accompany such situations, supposing them real. And real in this sense they have been to every human being who, from whatever source or delusion, has at any time believed himself under supernatural agency. Coleridge will write those poems. Rime of the Ancient Mariner. For the second class, subjects were to be chosen from ordinary life. The characters and incidents were to be such as will be found in every village and its vicinity, where there is a meditative and feeling mind, note, to seek after them or to notice them when they present themselves. So this is what gives rise to the lyrical ballads. So one comes at it from the supernatural side, and the other comes at it from the natural side. And so we have in Romanticism what Thomas Carlyle calls natural supernaturalism. So Victorian poet Thomas Carlyle, and this will be used as a title of a book by, what's his name now? M.H. Abrams. Oops, that one doesn't work at all. Very interesting book. An extended study of Wordsworth, actually. It does deal with other poets, but it's mostly on Wordsworth. And also of interest from Abrams is The Mirror and the Lamp, both interesting sort of foundational romantic texts by a critic from the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And that gives rise to the idea of the lyrical ballads. Wordsworth is to give the charm of novelty to things of every day, and he the otherwise. And he doesn't write many. He writes The Ancient Mariner, The Dark Lady, and Christabel. Great poems. But Wordsworth writes far more. And as he says, they were presented by him as an experiment. Isn't this interesting? Again, the Geisteswissenschaften. It's an experiment of sorts. Whether subjects could be referred and rejecting the usual ornaments and extra colloquial style of poems in general might not be so managed in the language of ordinary life as to produce the pleasurable interest, right? Teaching and delighting, which it is the peculiar business of poetry to impart. To the second edition, he adds a preface of considerable length, and in which, notwithstanding some passages of apparently a contrary import, yes, he contradicts himself, he was understood to contend for the extension of this style of poetry to poetry of all kinds. Coleridge's first objection. And worse, to reject as vicious and indefensible all phrases and forms of style that were not included in what he, unfortunately, I think, adopting an equivocal expression, called the language of real life. What is real life? Well, it's religious language is what it is. It is, to some degree, playing on the same sort of organ that Augustine is when he's talking about res insignia. There's the signs point to the thing. And what's the real thing? Real life. So there is a religious dimension to Wordsworth's thought when he's talking about this, and it's more vividly apprehended and experienced and instructive in the peasant. So there's an idealization of the common man, especially the common rural man. and he's going to take issue exactly with this here. We'll get to that in a sec. From this preface, prefixed to poems in which it was impossible to deny the presence of original genius, however mistaken its direction might be deemed, arose the whole long-continued controversy. And for from the conjunction of perceived power with supposed heresy, okay, so now that's the charge. I explain the inveteracy, and in some instances I grieve to say the acrimonious passions with which the controversy has been conducted by the assailants. So Wordsworth has now been charged with heresy, and probably Coleridge along with him by some. They're saying, hold on a second here. What you're saying is deeply problematic. Remember, this is 1817. Wordsworth's preface is written 17 years before this. 1800 is the second edition. Had his poems been the silly, the childish things which they were for a long time described as being, and being inane and mean in language, they must have sunk at once a dead weight into the slough of oblivion and have dragged a preface along with them. If it was really as trivial and pathetic and useless, but year after year increased the number of Mr. Wordsworth's admirers. And they were found interesting to not in the lower classes of the reading public, but chiefly among young men of strong sensibility and meditative minds. In other words, by the aristocrats who were now wanting to be sympathetic to the peasants. Remember the French Revolutions happened. What happened to the aristocrats? Lost their heads. Okay, I want to listen to those people a bit more here in England. And the king. We don't want that to happen here. I'm going to listen to you a little bit. And this is, I like this train of thinking. And their admiration, inflamed perhaps in some degree by opposition, was distinguished by its intensity, I might almost say by its religious fervor. Yes. Because he was suggesting, again, against the mechanistic materialism of the 18th century, that there was a spiritual nature to humanity, which the 18th century denied was there. And he said, oh no, it is real, which everybody who has a religious bone in their body also agrees with. Doesn't matter what the religion. So there's something deeply religious about Wordsworth's thoughts here. But what's the nature of the religion? That's where the charge of heresy comes in. Remember, Shelley is thrown out of Oxford University for calling for the necessity of atheism. At this time, right now, right a few years before this is written. Shelley's expelled for denying or saying that atheism is necessary because Christian faith is obsolete and is worthy of being abandoned. We have to go away from that. Is Mr. Wordsworth, who is so admired by Shelley, saying anything truly different from Shelley? And Wordsworth's going to say, oh yeah, I don't mean what Shelley means by it. And he says, oh yes, you do. You're just distancing yourself from it. You've become part of the establishment, but you mean exactly what you said. And I'm just not going to retreat from it because it's right. This is the real thing. It is in relation to this, etc. So hence the debate between the first and the second generation. So, these facts and the intellectual energy of the author, which was more or less consciously felt, were where it was outwardly and even boisterously denied, meeting with sentiments of aversion to his opinions and of alarm at their consequences, produced an eddy of criticism which would have itself borne up the poems by the violence with which it whirled them around and around. For now, with many parts of this preface, in the sense attributed to them, and which the words undoubtedly seem to authorize, I never concurred. So, he's being very, I think, kind and gentle with Mr. Wordsworth, because Wordsworth is his own worst enemy. He said, they're attributing this to him, and he says, yes, that's what I mean. And he doesn't seem to realize that this means that he's a heretic. And Coleridge is saying, no, you're not. You mean something better than what you say you mean, even though you double down and defend the position and say, no, it is exactly this. And they think, well, then this, and they get more and more angry at him. And he doesn't seem to get the issue. And the issue is because Wordsworth has a profound sense of God in everything. And that is because he is a panentheist. He sees God in everything. Theos in pan. And not in revelation per se, not in the word. He's explicitly going to move away from words and even attack words. And books, read book 6 of The Prelude. Talks about life in Cambridge and the life of the imagination as opposed to the life of bookish learning. They're going to attack bookish learning. Why bookish learning? For the reason I've already talked about up to this point in relation to what words actually are, which is an expression of feeling. And bookish learning is the ossification of feeling, if you will. It's the dead letter, to use Paul's words in a way that he didn't intend. And Mr. Wordsworth in his recent collection, as I find, degraded this prefatory disquisition at the end of his second volume to be read or not at the reader's choice. So he doesn't, Coleridge asks him, begs him to get rid of the preface, and he won't do it. He's stubborn and says, no, I know, but it's not a preface anymore, he throws it at the back of the volumes. But that's not good enough. Coleridge wants him to, get rid of it altogether, and even worse, he adds the imagination essay, which tips Coleridge over the edge. Okay, so how is he going to then attack this? Well, he's going to make just distinctions. He says the office of philosophical disquisition consists in just distinction between words and other words and what they entail. It's the privilege of a philosopher to preserve himself constantly aware that distinction is not division. You separate things, you distinguish them, but you see them in a unity. There's an integration there. There's a truth there, and things do relate to other things, but you have to say this is not that. You can't say it's all basically the same. It's not, in other words, panentheism is not going to suffice here for you. You're going to have to distinguish things and words meaning things. He will move on and talk about, where's his? My own conclusions, in the strictest sense of the word, have been in part anticipated in the preceding disquisition on fancy and imagination. What is poetry? Is so nearly the same question with what is a poet that the answer to the one is involved in the solution of the other. Prime agent, etc. Repetition of the finite mind, the eternal act of creation, and the infinite I am. For it is a distinction resulting from the poetic genius itself, which sustains and modifies the images, thoughts, and emotions of the poet's own mind. The poet, described in ideal perfection, brings the whole soul of man into activity, with subordination of its faculties to each other according to their relative worth and dignity. Now, again, you can't imagine Wordsworth ever coming up with views like this. There's a hierarchy, there's an order, there's a dignity. Just like the quote from Milton's Paradise Lost. There's a spirit of unity, and it blends and it fuses each to each, etc. All of this. Okay, but come on to, and I'm going to skip over 15, makes another excursion now to Shakespeare, Venus and Adonis. (16) the difference between the poets of the present age and those of the 15th and 16th century, and wants the merits of each to be. I will skip over that, and we'll go to 17. Because now he gets down to it. Examination of the tenets peculiar to Miss Wordsworth. And here's the summary. Rustic life, above all low in rustic life, especially unfavorable to the formation of human diction. It's not just not true, it's almost the opposite of this. The best parts of language, the product of philosophers, not of clowns or shepherds. Poetry is essentially ideal and generic. That's what Aristotle says. This is why poets and philosophers, they deal with truths expressed in different ways, but they deal with universal ideas. And the language of Milton is as much the language of real life, yea, incomparably more so than that of the cottager. Note that he is now talking about what? The language of Milton, not the feelings of Milton. Coleridge is logocentric. Wordsworth tends towards anti-logocentrism. So, my own differences from certain supposed parts of Mr. Wordsworth's theory ground themselves on the assumption that his words has been rightly interpreted, whatever. But my objection is first, that in any sense, this rule is applicable only to certain classes of poetry. He says, remember, all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. He says, remove the word all. Some good poetry is that. We'll say that. Secondly, that even to these classes, it's not applicable. Okay, so let's start by removing the all, and then actually let's just say what's left also doesn't hold true. Except in such a sense as hath never by anyone, as far as I know or have read, been denied or doubted. And lastly, so in other words, you're saying something that's totally redundant. And lastly, as far as it has, in that degree in which it is practical, yet as a rule it is useless, if not injurious, and therefore either need not or ought not to be practiced. Okay, well that's about as savage a demolition as that you can get. There's nothing that's true in what he says here, except what has been commonly agreed, and even there, it's not even worth saying because it's so bleeding obvious. And it's certainly not a rule. The poet informs us, his reader, that he had chosen low and rustic life, but not as low. It's not because it's low, but he chooses the low, but not for that reason. Because to do that would be to assume a hierarchy, which he's at odds to represent. So he just chooses this. Yeah, and he doesn't choose that, but he doesn't choose. He pretends it's not for this reason, as if the shepherd were noble. In other words, he's elevating, but he's not acknowledging that he's doing this. In order to repeat the pleasure of doubtful moral effect, which persons of elevated rank and of superior refinement oftentimes derive from a happy imitation of the rude, unpolished manners and discourse of their inferiors. That's what comedy does. For the pleasure so derived may be traced to three exciting causes: naturalness of things represented, apparent naturalness of the representation, and finally imitation as distinguished from a mere copy. So there's the delight. Aristotle says that human beings love to imitate. It's a distinctive human feature. Coleridge agrees with him. Goes on to some specific ones. But he then will move to the issue of nature and have a second significant disagreement with Coleridge, or with Wordsworth. If I can find it. Finding it's always a challenge on here. As little can I agree with the assertion that from the objects with which the rustic hourly communicates, the best part of language is formed. For first, if to communicate with an object implies such an acquaintance with it as renders it capable of being discriminately reflected on, the distinct knowledge of an uneducated rustic would furnish a very scanty vocabulary. They don't have a big toolbox of words. And few things and modes of action requisite for his bodily conveniences would alone be individualized, while all the rest of nature would be expressed by a small number of confused general terms. So that, first of all. Secondly, I deny that the words and combination of his words derived from the objects with which the rustic is familiar, whether with distinct or confused knowledge, can be justly said to form the best part of language. Tree, grass, cow, right? This is the best part of language? No. It is more than probable that many classes of the brute creation possess discriminating sounds. By the way, what Wordsworth and the Romantics do, of which Coleridge is not one, is they invert what Milton says about the order of creation. It's the other way around. They think that the roots, namely the feelings, are the hierarchy. They invert the hierarchy. They idealize the root. We hesitate to call the aggregate of such sounds a language other than metaphorically. Now, what is the best part of human language? I might have to continue this next time. But here it is, and this is very important. The best part of human language, properly so called, is derived from reflection on the acts of the mind itself. The acts of the mind, not the feelings. It is formed by a voluntary appropriation of fixed symbols to internal acts. What are the fixed symbols? The ones that God gives us in His Word, in Revelation. To processes and results of imagination, the greater part of which have no place in the consciousness of uneducated man, though in civilized society he might have picked it up. And how is that? He explains that. Well, he says that actually, if you listen to the language of the commoners, the rustics in England now, and compare them to 4 centuries ago, you would find that they use words that were never there back then, but they are there now. Why is that? Well, because at the commencement, they were used exclusively in the universities and the schools, but because of the Reformation, they had been transferred from the school to the pulpit and then passed to common life. And what's his further proof of this, not just historical comparison of how the commoners spoke then and how they speak now, it's when missionaries go overseas, they find great difficulty of finding words for the simplest moral and intellectual processes of the languages of the uncivilized tribes. I can't convey truths. They don't have a word for it. It doesn't exist. So how do I convey that to them then? And he adds to this, and I'm going to conclude with this, that their nature is greater than the nature in the northwest of England. They're in the Amazon, they're in Africa. It's sublime. It's grand, huge, beautiful, exotic, extraordinary. Less present, there are far few huge cities, and certainly not marked by the Industrial Revolution. Doesn't have the marks of the cities, and yet they don't have basic concepts that we do. So it's further proof to what he's saying there. I'll finish off with that because I've taken you over time and I'm drooping now.